Hi, I'm James and this is Newspeaks. How does the media disregard certain people and the views that they hold? I'd like to examine current Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn as an example.
Jeremy Corbyn, 251.
Labour is now a serious risk.
Labour under Jeremy Corbyn will hurt working people.
He seems like the kind of teacher everybody takes the mick out of when you first start school.
There is a sort of element of gentle media bullying going on of a chap who...
Nothing gentle about it.
Nothing gentle about it.
Now, firstly, I feel I must put my cards on the table and say that I'm an active supporter of Corbyn and the values he's a proponent of. More importantly still, I support the platform of direct democracy which led to his electoral victory.
Yes, we did! Yes, we did!
The election was a big story with mass participation from young and disillusioned people such as myself. Instead, the majority of media outlets chose to portray Corbyn as unelectable and a threat to the stability of our society.
We looked at the first week of press coverage, the first week after he was elected as leader, of the major newspapers, and we were pretty surprised by what we found, which was that 60% of all the news stories were overtly critical of Jeremy Corbyn. I think that's quite incredible, given that he had just been elected. The story should have been around the movement that brought him to power. What does this mean for British politics? But actually, it was very, very quick to set in the idea that Jeremy Corbyn was a problem. I think they're doing it simply because they don't really know what to make of this new radical Labour leader.
Why are there so many people underemployed or unemployed in Britain today?
Sorry, I just want to push you. Are you saying that profits are too high?
One way of dealing with that confusion is, it's a very simple one, which is that you mock, you jeer at, you make very crude assumptions about the leader instead of really trying to understand what is going on. The kind of tactics that have been used against Jeremy Corbyn have been used against other Labour leaders, against other left-wing figures, against other popular movements. Anyone who asks questions beyond those narrow sets of ideas, then that's when you find the media start to say, you know what, they're just too extreme. And it does us no good whatsoever. It means it shrinks public debate. It stops us finding out about important things going on in the world.
Put on a proper suit, do up your tie, and sing the national anthem!
That this is about large organisations and not individual journalists. Just two companies, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp and Lord Rothermere's Daily Mail Group, control nearly 60% of all newspapers in national circulation today.
So what is going on now is not in any sense new.
Is that the jumper that your mum made?
What is interesting and new about the Jeremy Corbyn phenomenon is that they are seen as a very serious threat to extremely powerful interests.
We now have a leader of the opposition who says quite openly he would never press the nuclear button. Does that worry you?
Well, it would worry me if that thought was translated into power, as it were.
There's no conspiracy about the coverage of Jeremy Corbyn. Most of the time, these are common sense assumptions that this thing is right, that immigration is a problem, that austerity is good. That filters down. And so journalists, broadcasters, people just start to think in those terms, and it's not in their interest to ask a difficult question. By and large, we're talking about multi-billion-pound operations. It's not surprising that they would share the same views and assumptions of other powerful stakeholders.
Days are gone where a Labour leader sucks up to newspaper proprietors or tries to satisfy them with pleasing announcements.
Can we expect the media to be fair, balanced and equal if the very society it reflects is so rife with inequality? We have to question, who is benefiting from this story? Once we see that, we can properly scrutinise and challenge the media messages we consume.
Hello, we are Shelf. I'm Rachel, this is Ruby.
Hello.
And we're doing a video for Newspeaks about Yemen.
Because we've heard that Britain is involved in a war in Yemen, and we were like, what?
That doesn't sound like Britain.
No, Britain stays out of the Middle East.
Famously. So we asked our friends and family if they knew a bit more about the situation in Yemen.
The difficulty we've had, I think, is getting that message out.
Scotland, more than any other government anywhere in the UK.
Thank you. That ends general questions. We now move to First Minister's questions. Question number one, Kezia Dugdale.
to ask the First Minister what engagements she has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Engagements to take forward the Government's ambitious programme for Scotland, including our plans to protect free school meals in Scotland from the impact of Tory cuts to tax credits.
Kezia Dugdale.
Today, Audit Scotland published a withering assessment of Scotland's justice system. The people in our courts work tirelessly, but they are being let down by government failures. The report points to budgets slashed, increased delays, performance targets missed, and wasted spending totalling £10 million. When Audit Scotland said her government had cut the Scottish Court Services budget by 4 times the rate of cuts to central government, does the First Minister think they were wrong?
First Minister.
I think they were not comparing like with like, and let me explain exactly what I mean by that. The total funding allocation to the Scottish Court Service in 2010-11 included a substantial capital allocation towards the redevelopment of the Parliament House Court complex here in Edinburgh. Work on the refurbishment of that project was completed in 2013, and obviously, therefore, that is reflected in the 2014-15 figures. The second point I would make is that the Government has taken steps to provide additional funding to the court service in response to particular pressures. So in 2014-15 we committed an additional £1.47 million for extra fiscals, judiciary and admin staff to address delays and speed up access to justice. And of course, during the current year, something I would hope Kezia Dugdale would welcome, we have provided a further £2.4 million to ensure the efficient progress of cases involving domestic abuse and sexual offences, and this funding will continue in the next 2 years. Now, those two amounts of funding I've mentioned, Presiding Officer, were in-year allocations, so they were additional to the baseline figures in which the Audit Scotland figures were calculated. So I would end where I started. I don't think, to quote these figures as Kezia Dugdale has just done, is fairly comparing like with like.
Kezia Dugdale.
Presiding Officer, these are Audit Scotland's numbers. They do the numbers, she does the spin on those numbers. And the reality is that the budget for the Crown Office has fallen by 14% and the budget for the Court Service by 28%. Even if you count in her comments around capital spending, that's a 12% reduction in revenue and a 17% reduction for the Court Service in particular. But we all know, when you put the numbers to one side, we're talking about 7 courts across Scotland being closed last year. And we warned the First Minister about the impact of these decisions. And now Audit Scotland confirms our courts are under pressure. The First Minister didn't promise to protect the justice system, though. She did promise to protect the NHS. In fact, in 2011, the First Minister told SNP Conference that patients in Scotland spent 200,000 days in a hospital bed when they didn't need to because the right care wasn't available in the community. At that time, the First Minister rightly said that that was too many. So I ask her today, how many is that number now?
First Minister.
Well, if she doesn't mind, I'll finish on courts and then I will move on to the health service. It's interesting that she didn't have any real comeback on courts once she had the facts that I'd given her earlier on.
Order.
She mentioned specifically court closures, and it would be interesting just to point out, as a matter of fact, that Audit Scotland actually doesn't address essentially the issue of court closures, but it does confirm that the courts closed were those dealing with relatively low volumes of business, in most instances less than 100 cases a year, or those located close to other courts. And the Court Service Chief Executive himself has said that any attempt to link court closures with increased waiting times simply, and I quote, muddies the water. And he said the current courts have the physical capacity to deal effectively with existing volumes of criminal and civil cases. But, perhaps one of the most interesting points in the Audit Scotland report, and I do welcome the report, and we will study it carefully and we will learn any lessons to be learned from it, but one of the most interesting points in it, I thought, was the observation that one of the issues at play here is the increase in the prosecution of more complex cases involving domestic abuse and sexual offences, and that's because there is more proactive detection of these cases and there is increased confidence of victims in reporting these cases. Now, I would have thought that is something that we should welcome and that the opposition should get behind the government in continuing to make sure those cases come to court. Now, I'll go on now to delayed discharges, because I have said, and this government has said repeatedly, that getting delayed discharges down is one of the key things we can do to reduce pressure on our acute hospitals. That's why I think it is something to be welcomed that the number of bed days lost in July, we saw this in statistics earlier this week, was down by nearly 10,000 since December last year. Now, just to put that into context, Presiding Officer, that is the equivalent of every single acute medical bed in NHS Highland for an entire month. So yes, Presiding Officer, still work to do. Of course there is, but real progress being made.
Mr. Gill.
Presiding Officer, here's the answer the First Minister was looking for in her book. In last year, patients in Scotland spent more than 612,000 days in a hospital bed when they were fit to go home. That means that it has more than trebled under the SNP government since this First Minister admitted that there was something badly wrong. So by any measure, that is unacceptable. That is thousands of patients, the majority of whom are elderly, ready to go back home or into the community, but can't because the extra support they need just isn't there. Now, I don't doubt for a second the First Minister's sincerity when it comes to this issue. She says she wants to tackle the problem. In fact, her Health Secretary in February said she wanted to completely eradicate delayed discharge this year. We welcomed that ambition. So can the First Minister tell us whether her Health Secretary is on track to meet that target?
First Minister.
The Health Secretary is working and is on track to eliminate delayed discharges. Let me give her some more.
Order.
This is a serious issue, and Labour, having raised it...
Order.
In July 2006, there were 1,242 patients delayed over 3 days. This is important, Presiding Officer, and I'll exercise the patience so that we can hear these figures. In July 2006, there were 1,242 patients delayed over 3 days. In August 2015, that was down to 731 patients delayed over 3 days. In July 2006, there was 1,055 patients delayed over 2 weeks. In August 2015, there were 481 delayed over 2 weeks. But it's not just that, Presiding Officer. The average length of delay in July 2007 was 52 days. That, by August 2015, had been halved to 23 days. So, yes, there is more work to be done to eliminate delayed discharges, as we have committed to doing. But any reasonable, objective person looking at these figures would know that there has been significant progress made. And lastly, Presiding Officer, Kezia Dugdale, at the outset, I think, of her last question, mentioned the health budget. And in her first question, she was keen to take the word of Audit Scotland as gospel. So let me end with a quote from the Auditor-General in October 2014. The Scottish Government has managed to protect the NHS budget.
Kezia Dugdale. Ms Dugdale.
See, there's a trend here, Presiding Officer. Time and time again, we see the SNP government introduce lots of targets with great fanfare, but then they run for cover when they fail to deliver on them. It was in deepest winter when Shona Robeson pledged to abolish delayed discharge. Patients in Scotland spent